Let me welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today for this about 45-minute webinar. Our topic today is ensuring quality in clinical trials with proper oversight, key considerations for the small and stretch sponsor. My name is Dana Lefnijelska. I'm the CEO of August Research and I'll be serving as moderator today. Our agenda for today will be, I'll go over some introductions of our two speakers. We will then review quickly the current ICH GCP requirements for sponsors. One of our speakers will cover the general CRO and vendor oversight best practices, and then we'll dig into specific areas around oversight of clinical trial sites, oversight of data management, and biostatistics. Then we'll have some summary closing thoughts, and finally, question and answer period. Please put all questions in the Q&A option in at the bottom of your screen. We won't be doing live questions, so if you just put your questions there, we'll review them at the end and get to as many as we can. All right. So first, just a quick information about the co-sponsors of the webinar today. As I mentioned, I'm the CEO of August Research, and we are a clinical operations focused CRO working in Europe for our US clients. Our second sponsor today is Harbor Clinical, and Harbor Clinical is a clinical research services firm providing solutions across all functional areas of the clinical trial process. Both August Research and Harbor Clinical are WeBank women-owned businesses, with WeBank certified businesses. Moving to our two speakers today, we have Anda Kachip, who is the Quality Assurance Manager at August Research, and she's been working in the clinical trials field for more than 15 years. At August Research, she oversees the QA activities for the company, including SOP management, audits and inspections, and staff training on QA and ICH GCP related topics. Prior to joining August Research, she worked at a global CRO performing audits and QC activities across Europe. Our second speaker will be AJ Sadwani, who's an executive life science professional with over 20 years of clinical research experience. His experience in clinical and data operations includes strategic development and quality assurance management. With the increased regulatory importance of proper vendor oversight, AJ has focused his energies recently in helping Harbor Clinical's clients ensure high quality deliverables through comprehensive vendor oversight. Very relevant to our topic today. So with that, let me turn it over to Anda to get us started.
Thank you, Dana, and hello, everybody. So as Dana mentioned, let's start by presenting the general ICH GCP framework regarding sponsor involvement in quality management and oversight. If the original ICH was not very specific, with the revision in 2017, more specific information was added in this regards. Namely, it was specifically requested in section 5.0, which is a totally new section, that the sponsors should have a system to manage quality. With this addendum, the expectation is that quality is managed throughout the life cycle of the study, focusing on those activities which are essential for human subject protection and data reliability. It is also expected that protocols, tools, and procedures used are efficient, clear, and concise. Next slide. So all aspects of the trial should be operationally feasible, and unnecessary complexity, procedures, and data collection should be avoided. And of course, when putting in place a quality management system, a risk-based approach should be used. Next slide, Dana. Okay, so in terms of sponsors' responsibilities, as far as CRO or other vendors are concerned, if in the previous ICH GCP version, it was mentioned that the sponsor is the ultimate responsible party, the 2017 addendum specifically introduces oversight as a sponsor responsibility. This means that the sponsor needs to oversee the CRO that is contracted and also the vendors that the CRO subcontracts. A thing to be mentioned here is that this requirement was not created to make life harder or to create additional work for the sponsors. Actually, the reason for it was triggered by major regulatory agency findings identified during inspections when it was noted that the sponsor did not have too much control over their subcontractors. Next slide. Okay, now as we've got regulations out of the way, here are some tips and strategies that could help you implement oversight, applicable for several steps of the study. I'm not going to comment on the CRO selection process, but I'm going to say a few things about contracting with the CRO, because this is an area where you can have a big impact on quality and set some standards from the very beginning of your study. So when you are starting a study, make sure you incorporate a lot of strategies into the contracts. So that is clarity about expectations and performance. Some example of quality expectations that you can include in your contracts or work orders would be related to staff training requirements. For example, you may add therapeutic expertise for the vendor's staff, or if needed, a certain years of numbers of experience. You may also want to list in the contract that you would only like to use validated systems for your trial. You can also think of the KPIs that you'd like to take into considerations during the study. One example would be the staff turnover rate, because when staff are changed multiple times, quality shortfalls may occur. Clear delegation of activities should also be included in the contract. In this regard, you may use a project responsibilities table to clearly designate sponsor versus CRO's responsibility. Keep in mind that anything which is not clearly delegated to the vendor will remain with you as the sponsor. This is also the moment when you can plan for oversight of vendors, which are contracted by your main CRO. For this, you can add a list of the subcontracts in the project work orders, or you can add a requirement that the sponsor needs to approve the subcontractors before they are used for the study. You may also want to develop and include it in the MSA a schedule for CRO reevaluation performance reviews. This would help you at a later stage, and it will make clear what you expect from the CRO. Next slide. After the contract is in place, the next phase of the study, when you can take some measures that would improve oversight and adherence to quality, would be the kickoff. And at this point, you can identify and communicate critical study endpoints up front and complete a thorough risk management analysis with the CROs or with other vendors. You can collaborate with the CRO or with the vendors in order to prepare or to review study-related plans, like project management plan, communication plan, or a risk management plan. This would also be the moment to talk about SOPs to be used. And in the absence of sponsor SOPs, the confirmation that the CRO or the vendor has SOPs in place to cover all trial aspects should be obtained. Communication is very important. So during this early stage, you should establish the communication and issue escalation pathways and make sure you document these in your study plans or guidelines. Next slide. We've been talking about what to do when contracting or during the early kickoff phases of the study, but what can you do during the study to improve oversight? Of course, you'll be having regular meetings with the CRO or with the vendor staff, but make sure that you do not let the CRO drive the whole agenda of a call or of a meeting. They may talk only about issues that they are most comfortable with, but as a sponsor, you should be asking the tough questions for those areas that the CRO may have problems with or would like to skip them over. So the idea is that communication should cover all aspects of the trial and not only those that the CRO wants. Make sure that you keep meeting minutes and that these meeting minutes include information about the participants, about what was discussed, about who is responsible for follow-up. These documents could become important if any issues arise. You may also want to consider an ongoing study outputs review. For example, perform an ad hoc review of the study metrics or monitoring visit reports, of deviation logs, of audit trails for the systems that are used in the study. These kind of spot check reviews will give you a better oversight. So you will not only rely on what the CRO tells you, but you'll have your own picture of what is going on in the study. Reviewing the monitoring visit reports is of special importance because this will give you a better oversight of the monitor, of the changes to the site team, and if things are not clear, then you can ask additional information from the CRO so that you have a clear understanding of the situation. Co-monitoring visits should also be considered. Co-monitoring visits with the CRO study monitors, but we will talk later about how you can organize this type of activities. And one important aspect to consider here is that all oversight activities are documented, including outcome, including corrective and preventive actions that were taken. And as an auditor, I can tell you, if it's not documented, it did not happen. Next slide. So far, we've been discussing about strategies for oversight for any type of vendor. Now, I would like to turn to oversight for your clinical trial sites. Coming back to regulations, ICH GCP states that in addition to being responsible for vendors, the sponsor also has responsibility for the quality of the clinical trial sites. Next slide. So first of all, it is important that you are involved in the site qualification process. Of course, you are delegating a lot of actions to the CRO, but you still need to be involved in the evaluation of the site team qualifications and in the assessment of the facilities or of the third parties that could be involved in the trials. This means that you should ask questions. You should ask questions about things which are not clear. For example, the site qualification visit reports. You should not just accept them with no details, with no information, with just yes and no answers, or with check boxes only. At the same time, you should rely on your CRO expertise regarding their prior experience with the sites. You should not insist on recruiting a site which the CRO recommends not to be used. I've encountered situations when the sponsor did not pay attention to CRO recommendations and selected sites who later on during the study had some quality issues. We've been talking about the importance of adding quality language in the contracts with the CRO or with the vendors, and the same would apply for site contracts. In this case, you may want to consider adding reference to local regulations controlling clinical trials, and not only US CFR regulations. This is applicable, of course, for sites located outside the US. And you should also include quality expectations in the contracts with the site. Quality expectations in terms of performance, such as CRF completion timelines or query resolution timelines, and in terms of facilities, like equipment requirements or minimum staffing levels, depending on the study. This will help you have leverage for the sites when they do not perform. And once the study is running, you have something documented. And when the sites committed to certain actions and they did not respect them, you can use the contract to try and put things back on track. Next slide. And once the trial is operational, you still need to maintain some level of oversight. And you can achieve that by having a regular review of the site data. As I mentioned before, monitoring visit reports review, review of the deviation logs, a review of safety report distribution logs, or review of the TMF. Monitoring visit reports have important information, and if you really want to have an idea, you should be looking at those monitoring visit reports and ask questions if things are not clear. Regular communications with the site is also methods of oversight. You can have periodic meetings or calls with the investigators. You can organize visits with the site staff. This would not be possible now due to the pandemic, but maybe next year, hopefully. In this regard, I can say that we have clients who visited the key countries for the trials, and they organized local meetings with the PIs or even visited the sites to understand their processes. You can also organize calls, direct calls with any non-compliant site teams. And in case of non-compliant teams, you can also organize direct communication with the assigned CRA to get a better understanding of what's going on. And even if a CRO may be reluctant to allow direct contact with the CRA or with the site team, as part of your oversight, you are entitled to have that in order to investigate what is happening. Next slide. As a small sponsor, you may not be able to do all these things, like dig into all the details, visit the sites, and so on. So you can share responsibilities internally within your organization with other departments like clinical management or medical affairs, quality assurance, or you can consider outsourcing this to independent consultant groups or QA or audit groups or even to CROs. This external support can be useful for the sites, especially sites located in other countries with different languages and different cultures. External support can be provided by consultants who may perform site calls or co-monitoring visit or audits on your behalf and may communicate the outcome to you directly. This will help you discover issues earlier, resolve them faster, and build a strong sponsor connections to sites, which in the end can drive enrollment, will help keeping the CRO honest, and can save money and time. Now I'm handing it over to AJ. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Anda. I appreciate that overview from an oversight perspective at the vendor level and also at the clinical site level. So that was great. So for my portion of the next set of slides, I wanted to talk about oversight at the data management level and at the biostatistics level as well. These are two special functions that have unique vendor oversight needs. So I'll go into data management first and go into biostatistics right after that. So a lot of people view data management as this ubiquitous black box that is just managed by the CRO. However, I think those of you that are in data management or those of you that have quite a bit of experience in data management recognize that data management is not a black box. It does require active oversight to ensure it's being conducted properly. Ultimately, data is what you're seeking at the end of your trial, so active oversight of data management is required. And some key areas for oversight that I'll go through are the experience level of your team, the processes used for data management, third parties, and how oversight of third parties is being done, and specifically who in your organization at the sponsor level do you have in place to help oversee data management, and how will you plan on doing it? Next slide, please. From a experience and quality level and from the CRO perspective, there are some key elements to look at from a data management perspective. So for your team that you're receiving from the CRO, are you actually engaging with the CRO in advance to recognize who is your data manager supporting you? Many times sponsors ask for CVs or qualify their project manager, their CRAs, et cetera, but often just accept who's been assigned to them from a data management perspective. The data manager has a key role, obviously, in the study, and you want to ask questions such as, does the data manager have experience in your specific study indication? Do they understand the data, the clinical aspect of your trial, or are they using EDC? Are they EDC users? Do they have tenure and experience with the clinical team? Is there chemistry within the clinical team and the data management team? Because clearly the data manager works very closely with the clinical group, and they also work very closely with the biostats group. So do they have that tenure and relationship with the team that's working with them? And then where are they located? How will you interact with them? Are they in your time zone? Are they going to be able to provide you answers to questions that you have or feedback regarding the data quality of your study in a timely manner given their location? So these are key areas to look at from a team perspective. Next slide, please. In addition, once you've understood who your team is going to be and are satisfied with the team, have you addressed the processes that are being used to conduct data management? Many CROs have processes in place for data management, but are they complete? Have you vetted them? Have you looked into, are they going to address the specific needs of the study? Are they going to address what's unique about your study? What's unique about the team that's been working with them? So digging deeper into the processes are really important. So for example, what is the data review process that's being followed for the study? Our data being reviewed by CRF page, by visit, by patient, et cetera. While this may not seem like a big deal at the beginning of the study, it does have an impact on you, especially as timelines as you look into timelines, because there's certainly pros and cons to each approach, and you just want to understand what approach is being followed and how that'll fit into your timelines for your study. From a manual review process, what is being reviewed by the CRO from a manual review process, or are they simply just relying on the standard edit checks that are being programmed, the standard logic checks that are being programmed? Are they really digging into the cross-form checks, I should say, to ensure that the data, the logic checks across the forms within the EDC system are consistent and complete? How are data being reconciled with your third party data? And how frequent is it being done? Are you only going to recognize data reconciliation issues at the end of the study, or will you be aware of them during the course of the study as well so that they can be addressed moving forward? What is the process and time frame for snapshots and data deliveries? During the study, most studies have some sort of snapshot or have some sort of delivery that needs to be done, whether it's for a poster, whether it's for an abstract, etc. So the question is, what's the time frame for that, and how much notice is required in order to have the cleanest data available for these snapshots? And digging into that and making sure you understand that process so that you're prepared for that is an important oversight consideration. How are staff within data management trained? So you may have good experience with the lead data manager, but underneath the lead data manager, there are likely others supporting that lead data manager. How are they being trained? How are they being trained in the study? How are they managing the multiple studies that they likely oversee as well to ensure that your study is getting the unique attention that it needs? What is that process, and how is that being documented, and how is that being implemented for your needs? And then specifically metrics. Are you getting metrics that are tailored to your study, or are you just getting generic metrics that, while important, may not be really beneficial? Maybe it may not be really beneficial for you to understand what's going on with the study. So these are key areas from a process perspective to review to ensure that there's adequate oversight of your data management vendor. Next slide, please. So third parties are another key areas from a data management perspective that need to be addressed. More and more studies are using third-party data as an endpoint for the study, lab data, wearable data, ePro data, etc. So the questions surrounding data quality and data process flow for these third parties becomes more and more important. And so questions to ask or items to look into from an oversight perspective is, have the vendors who are providing this third-party data, had they been qualified by the QA group? Had they been qualified by the CRO's QA group? Who actually chose these third-party vendors for your study? Have their data quality procedures been reviewed, and are they acceptable to you? What is the data flow that's taking place between the CRO and the third party? Who is verifying that the transfers are being provided accurately, that they're complete, that data aren't missing? Who is responsible then? How can you be assured that that's being done so that when you go and report on this key third-party data, you feel confident that what you're actually delivering is of high quality? If there are cleaning issues, query processes, what is that cleaning process for third-party data? I've seen in several studies that with new vendors, they're primarily focused on technology, and data management is not necessarily factored into the third-party data themselves. So if that particular ePro vendor or that wearable vendor is not, or that lab data for that matter, isn't focused as much on data quality in the transfer process, who is actually going to be overseeing that process to ensure that the data that you're receiving are as clean as possible to help you make decisions and help you do accurate reporting? And similarly, from a reconciliation perspective, the same sort of process. What is the reconciliation process with the third party and the EDC system if that data are entered within EDC? And then again, along the same theme, how are queries resolved with third-party vendors? So there's a whole host of cleaning questions and that need to be addressed when working with third parties, especially now given the importance of these third parties in the conduct of clinical trials and in the reporting of clinical trial data. Next slide, please. So once you've vetted your CRO from a personnel perspective, a process perspective, and a third-party perspective, now the onus goes to you as a sponsor. How are you going to oversee that CRO yourself? Do you have expertise to ask these questions? Do you have a process in place for how you're going to do this on a consistent basis to continue to check in and make sure that the processes are being followed? Are you qualified? Is your staff qualified to do that? Are you an army of one person per se that only has that is supporting multiple functions? do you have a counterpart to help oversee the CRO, and what's your review process? So these are key questions for the sponsor to consider when working in data management. It's a specialized function, there's no question. It requires some specialized skills to make sure that the considerations that I mentioned in the prior slides are being addressed. So other areas of consideration, are, as I mentioned, are on the slide here are the data review and internal lock process. And so it goes back to what, from a sponsor perspective, how are you going to handle some of these items that come up during the course of the study? So key areas for you to consider going forward. Next slide, please. So that covered the data management portion of what I wanted to share with you regarding oversight. Biostatistics is similar. It's a unique function that has unique oversight needs as well. Along the same lines as the series of items that I mentioned, data management, the same sorts of considerations need to be considered from an oversight perspective here. The quality and experience level of the team supporting you from a biostats perspective, the scope of the activities that you're actually providing, and how the documentation of that scope is going to be completed. What are the QC procedures that are being performed by the biostats group to ensure you receive quality output from them? And then similarly, who on your side, on the sponsor side, is actually going to look at what they're producing and provide feedback to them on their myriad of questions that they're going to ask you during the course of the study. So I'll go into each of these in the next sets of slides. Next slide, please. So similarly, as I mentioned in data management, the biostatistician or the biostats team needs to be vetted as well to ensure that they're the right team for your study. Again, as I said, similar in data management, the biostats team isn't often assessed from a CV perspective or for, to ensure that they have the experience to perform on your study, or they have the relevant clinical knowledge or analysis experience in your specific indication or therapeutic area. So these are questions you might want to ask along the way. Does your statistician have this experience? Do they have experience in providing SDTM analysis programming? Do they have experience in your indication? Can they help with data cleaning, or can they identify quality issues with experience from prior studies within your indication? How long have they actually worked with the CRO, and do they have experience working with the data management team? I think that you want to just really assess who it is that's being assigned to your study, and don't be afraid to ask questions, push back, and even request additional resources or additional individuals if you feel that the quality or the fit for the individual is not the right one for your study. You don't have to simply accept who's been assigned to your study. Next slide, please. And similarly, as I mentioned, data management, the scope. What is the scope of activities for statistical activities within the study? This is where this is unique in the sense that a scope is, for biostats, is typically thought of at the very beginning and isn't often changed during the course of the study, and so which can lead to challenges. So, for instance, once the study starts, an afterthought is someone from biostats actually reviewing the study protocol? And if so, how is their input going to be documented? Is the study blinded, and is there a randomization list that's being provided? And who is going to review that from a biostats perspective, and how is that going to be provided to you? Is the biostats person, or is the biostats group going to provide input on other documents, and has that been factored into your workflow and into your contract with the biostats group? From a SAP perspective, who is actually creating the SAP, and how many versions have been factored into the SAP creation? We all know with study amendments, this number can certainly go up from the initial thought of when the study was initially scoped. So what is the actual scope for number of versions of the SAP, and when will the SAP actually start? Is SDTM programming actually in the scope of your project, and who's actually going to be providing and reviewing that SDTM output? So biostatistics has a unique scope to it that has a tendency to grow with the study as amendments come through, as the study expands. And the question is making sure that you keep on top of this and understanding what the scope is during the course of study, so you can be sure that you're getting the quality that you need, plus you're also aware of how changes that you're making in the protocol will impact biostats downstream. So, next slide, please. Similar to data management, QC is a key aspect of biostats. What is the quality control procedures that are being used by the vendor? Again, this is something that oftentimes the answer that's provided is double programming. So that's great. So double programming is used from a quality control process, but the question is, how is that being documented, and how can you as a sponsor be assured that it's done? What can you receive from the CRO to give you satisfaction that this level of quality is being completed? If randomization is part of the scope of the statistics work, how do you know that it's been QC'd, and what are the steps that have been implemented to ensure that the randomization steps were actually followed? If you're asking the biostats vendor to provide ad hoc analysis, how is that scope being done, and how is that testing being listed? One of the things that happens a lot in trials, especially in early phase trials, is there's data exploration that takes place when a signal is seen or when other data trends appear. So the question is, if you're asking for this additional ad hoc analysis, how can you be assured that this is being done at a quality level and it's being documented? Data transfers obviously are a key part of the biostatistics process. How are these actually being provided to the biostats team? Is it data management that's providing these transfers? Are the biostats team getting these transfers directly from the system? And how do you make sure that the biostats team is getting everything that's being transferred to them that is accurate and complete? And then similarly, what's the process for the distribution of TLFs prior to you receiving it as a sponsor? What is biostats doing to ensure quality in the TLFs that you're receiving, so that your role is not in QCing the TLFs, but your role is actually reviewing the data? There's a clear distinction there, and you want to make sure that what you're getting is of high quality, so you can focus your effort on data as opposed to smaller QC related issues. So additional considerations for oversight from a biostats perspective. Next slide, please. And then similar to data management is who on your side is equipped to answer questions that the biostats team will have, let alone review the information that'll be provided to you from a biostats perspective. Do you have anyone in your group that's qualified to do so? Do you have a biostats counterpart that can work with the CRO vendor to help you ensure that what you're receiving makes sense, to help answer your questions? Do you have a review process internally for how you're going to review the statistical documentation? Do you have a review process of how you're going to review the TLFs and provide feedback to the stats team that you're satisfied with the output? So these are considerations on the sponsor side to ensure that you understand what you're going to do with all this information once it comes to you, and how you're going to have that conversation with the biostats team from the CRO. So those are the key slides that I wanted to talk about from a biostats and a data management perspective. So next slide, please. So just some thoughts, from what you've heard so far in closing. Obviously, Anda had shared with you a little bit earlier the importance of having oversight plans and setting expectations in your relationship with the CRO and vendor. I articulated some of these items as well. I didn't articulate it directly as Anda did, but I inferred I did mention them as it relates to biostats and data management. Just understanding the expectations that you have from the CRO and vendors is key. Communication, as in most things, is also a key element of oversight. Just making sure that the pathways are clear, how things are going to be done, and try to limit the number of levels of reporting so that messages don't get lost or muted. So communication obviously is key. And then this last step is I think is really important. I think it applies to a lot of small sponsors and also bigger sponsors as well. Don't be intimidated by the vendor. you ultimately are responsible for the oversight. You ultimately need to ask the questions. You need to ensure that the work is being done. There is no such thing as a silly question, and you just need to be satisfied with the work product that you're getting, and you should be asked whatever you need until you're satisfied. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Dana.
Okay, thanks, AJ. Great. Thanks both for those really in-depth and thorough presentations. I do want to confirm that we will be sending the slide deck to all participants of the meeting. We'll have that list. We'll send it out. There will also be a recording available, but that won't be available as soon. But both of them will be available to all participants. Now let's move to some Q&A. We've gotten a few questions and I'll read through them. The first question actually is for AJ. This is a little bit of something technical related to what you said. Would you expect the stats individual to have a PhD in order to showcase their level of experience? Maybe you can talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I think that's a function of what your expectation is as a sponsor regarding the requirements that you have. Certainly, many statisticians have PhDs, and there's also many statisticians that have other advanced degrees as well. So the question is that a requirement for you or not? So for me, it's not an expectation per se. It is something that is part of the overall review and assessment of the individual's capabilities to be able to provide you the statistical services that you need.
Great, thanks. And Anda, here's a question for you. You mentioned that for small sponsors, responsibilities can be shared and outsourced. The question is, how do regulatory agencies feel about CROs overseeing other CROs? Would this be seen as layering the complexity or adding more complexity?
Mm-hmm. So yes, if there's no possibility of organizing the oversight activities internally, then this should be outsourced. And I think that as long as oversight is completed and it's documented and you have evidence that you are aware of what's going on in your study, the agencies wouldn't mind having oversight completed by another CRO. And actually, you will have from the other CRO or another consulting company, you would have a direct feedback. While as with the CRO that you are contracting, you will still need to do your oversight, and you will not be able to have a direct communication unless the CRO part needs to with the sites or with the other vendors.
Okay, thanks. AJ, this is a question for you. Which professional resources do you recommend a small stretch sponsor use for gap analysis and proactive sponsor oversight training?
Okay. I think from a gap analysis perspective, I would look to quality assurance consultant or quality assurance auditor to support that. That individual can go through the sponsor's procedures, the sponsor's documents, the overall processes used by the sponsor for oversight, and provide gaps or indicate where there are gaps from a quality perspective. In addition, I would incorporate a project manager or someone that has in-depth understanding of how clinical trials are to be conducted from a sponsor perspective, and have them point out key functions and key intersection points between sponsor and CRO, and work with quality assurance in parallel to identify those areas that do need to be addressed as well from a gap perspective and from a process and oversight perspective.
Okay, thanks. Anda, here's another question for you. As a former auditor, can you give us some real examples of inspection findings which were related to a lack of sponsor oversight?
Yes. So yeah, during inspections, some of the most common findings related to lack of sponsor oversight were related, for example, to the fact that there was no documentation or inadequate documentation to demonstrate if the monitoring visits reports, which were created by the CROs, were reviewed by whom from the sponsor were reviewed, and what was the outcome of the review. Some of the findings refer to the fact that there was no documentation to demonstrate that the sponsor reviewed the protocol deviations occurring in the trial. Lack of oversight of trial master files, which were held by vendors, was also identified. Due to the fact that the sponsor did not actually review the TMF, actually the TMFs were not up to date and were not complete. Another thing could refer to, another deficiencies were related to the fact that the CRO were reporting the SUSARs to ethics committee late, but the CRO was not aware of and did not have oversight of it. And another example would be that the CRO was not informed. The CRO was not informing the sponsor about the vendors which were used, and thus the sponsor, not being aware, could not actually exercise any oversight.
Okay, that's a pretty big list.
Yes.
Thank you. I think it certainly reflects a lot of the points that you mentioned in your slides about sponsors not being able to release their oversight just by hiring a CRO. Okay, AJ, here's another question that came through on the Q&A. How do you find the balance between weighing in and having oversight versus ensuring the CRO take responsibility and feeling ownership themselves?
Yeah, that's a very tricky balance. I certainly understand that. I think ultimately you have to let the CRO do the work, but then provide them with concrete examples if they're not meeting the expectation or if they're not meeting the mark of what you're looking for. You know, as part of the overall oversight plan with that particular CRO, I think you want to specify what QC, what oversight will be provided, and how you'll provide that feedback to them. And then once that feedback is provided, what the next steps will be at the CRO level, given that feedback. So if you set that up in the beginning with regard to, yes, this is what we're going to do to oversee the work product that you're providing, this is the checkpoints that we're going to have, this is the way the feedback will be delivered to you, and then collaborate with the CRO with regard to, okay, once we receive this, here's what we're going to do to address this. And then here's our escalation path if the initial process that we implemented is not being met. So if you can have this conversation at the beginning of the study or during the course of the study with a clear process for how feedback will be provided, then that provides you the time and sets a clear expectation of what you'll be doing, and then the CRO has that rule book as well of what you're going to be following so that they can be prepared on their end to address any gaps and issues that you come up with during that review.
Okay, and this is actually related, maybe AJ, and then Anda, if you have comments as well. Can you elaborate on the methods of documenting sponsor oversight activities? Any tips on the information to be included in the CRO oversight plan? Is it common to share the oversight plan with the CRO so they are aware of the oversight activities?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, certainly the best place to start is with the statement of work, right? In the statement of work, you want to clarify what exactly your deliverables are, and then from the statement of work, then you can move over to the transfer of obligations that are being completed for the study. So again, those two documents set the stage for what exactly the expectation, what you're contracting with the vendor, and then what you're expecting them to perform. So those two serve as your roadmap with regard to what they're actually providing. And from there, I would move over to the vendor oversight plan to talk about how those two elements are going to be addressed and how they're going to be overseen to ensure that those two items are being addressed. So those are the three key documents that I would have in place that are likely in place anyway for all your projects to ensure that it's being done. And then within the oversight plan as well is you want a tactical, how are you going to do it section. What does that mean? What does the oversight actually mean? And as I mentioned in an answer to my previous question, Are you going to have monthly check-ins with a monthly, you know, a checklist or maybe even a report card that addresses the 5 or 6 or whatever number of elements are key for oversight from an oversight perspective? So that checklist coupled with the evaluation or assessment of how things have been going is another tool or document that can be used to address how performance has been, how things have gone from performance perspective. And then you also want to be flexible and update the vendor oversight plan as the study changes, because things will happen, things will change, and that assessment, that report card, if you will, can then be used to drive further change in the oversight plan. So those are some of the documentation methods that I would suggest.
Okay, thanks. And here's one question, and I'm not sure if it's out of the scope of your expertise, but AJ, do you have any tips on how to conduct oversight of a central lab used in a clinical trial?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple, this is related to, from a data management perspective, I had alluded to a third-party oversight plan. So certainly with the lab itself, there are key elements of oversight as well. There's setting up the processes for how samples will be shipped to the, first of all, how supplies will be generated, how supplies will be shipped to clinical sites, how samples will be sent, how samples will be analyzed, how samples will be stored, how samples will be tracked, how samples will be, how troubleshooting of samples will take place. So there's a whole laundry list of steps associated with how to work with a central lab that are likely in the lab manual itself, but certainly an oversight, a vendor oversight document that references, again, as I said, the statement of work with the lab, the lab manual, coupled with whatever is being associated with that lab should be documented. That not only covers the operational aspects of how to work with the lab, but also how problem resolution will take place, and how data transfers will take place, and how quality of the actual data will be overseen as well.
Okay, thanks for taking that one as well. Well, we promised we'd finish by 1/4 of the hour, and it looks like we're over just by a minute or two. So I think we'll close the session there. There were a couple other questions that were entered, and we'll try to respond directly to those participants. But thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much to our speakers, AJ and Anda, for preparing and providing so much information to the participants. As I said, we will follow up with these slides, and there's contact information in the deck if you have further questions or would like to get in touch with either August Research or Harper Clinical. So with that, we'll wish you an enjoyable rest of your day and hope to keep in touch. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.